to apply them. And of course, all those things can happen at the same time. So for some reason, controls aren't working all that great here. So first of all, some don'ts, okay? Don't plow and plant a field with vines all in the same spring. We'll talk about why in a minute. And don't go looking for any sort of silver bullet for weed control or a herbicide that's going to get rid of all of your weed problems, because that's just not going to happen. And generally, don't take summer vacation. Probably, don't take vacation in spring, summer, or fall. And if you own a winery, don't take vacation during the winter either, right? But you can't, you just can't go away with, and that of course doesn't apply, that does not refer just to weed control. It's virtually everything that you're doing in the vineyard. You've got to love this because you're kind of married to it. So I mentioned earlier that you shouldn't plow a field and plant it to grapevines all in 1 year, because you're going to have huge problems with perennial weeds. And what you're looking at is a field, actually a corn soybean field north of Worcester where I live. And this is a field, a no-till cornfield, no-till soybean field that didn't get planted last spring because the weather was so wet, as you'll recall. And these are the patches of Canada thistle that have emerged all over that field that the month before this would have looked like it had no weeds in it at all. So if you plow up a field and plant vines or any other crop in it, that's what's going to happen to you. And this happens to be a raspberry field, one of our test plots, but it illustrates this point so well because we had actually sprayed Roundup on the field when we planted the raspberry plants the previous spring. And within 12 months, it's full of thistle and other perennial weeds, because you can't, even if you spray Roundup, you can't get rid of those weeds in 1 year. It takes probably a 2-year process to really do that right. And then some do's. The reciprocal of what I've just pointed out is that you should start getting the site ready for planting vines 1.5 years, 2 years before you plant. And again, it's not just for weed control. There's a whole host of reasons why you should do that, from having good hydraulic conductivity through the soil. In other words, water moves through the soil well, which is really, really important, as many of you know. Getting the pH where it should be, correcting nutritional deficiencies in the soil. You need to know your weeds, because if you need to think of herbicides as prescription drugs for weeds, okay? So just like you wouldn't just reach into the medicine cabinet and take anything because you happen to have, we won't get into sore throats and things like that, but you wouldn't do that, and you should not just take any herbicide off the shelf and put it on your field either without knowing what the weeds are that you're trying to control first. And then I have this odd idea of 0 seed threshold written there. And it's not really so cryptic. I just mean that you don't let weeds go to seed. The way to get rid of your weed problem is not to let weeds go to seed in your vineyard. That may sound like an impossible task, but there are people who do that, even in a state like Ohio, do it with a relative, very high degree of success. And their weed problem has largely disappeared. So site preparations should start, if you're planning to plant in 2022, this is the year when you should be getting that field ready. Again, not just for weed control, but for many other reasons. But when it comes to weed control, it needs to start 2 years before planting. And I'm going to flip ahead here really quickly. So if you're dealing with sod ground that's in pasture or has been in hay crop, again, you want to be at it 2 years before you plant. And you should really be looking at some repeated tillage that you do several times, kind of deep tilling of the soil, to get those perennial weeds to, if you want to kill them, you got to get them to grow first. if you don't plow the field, they're kind of lying in a dormant, acquiescent state in the field. And you can spray all you want to on it. You won't get particularly good weed control. So you use tillage as a way to kind of reactivate, get the life into those perennials, get them growing, and then you use your herbicides to kill them after they've started to grow very actively. So the idea is that over this year and a half or so that you're getting the ground ready, you've kind of wore out all the reserves that are in those perennials. And I talk about the herbicides that we're using there. If you happen to have some ground, some fields that were growing Roundup Ready corn and soybeans for a number of years, you may not have much sod left there at all. So it's a little different situation there. But the point is that you don't start this in the spring of 2020 and plant in the spring of 2020, or you're going to have a lot of trouble. This is actually just a page from one of our extension guides that talks about this, how you can control certain weeds, because not all perennial weeds are the same either. So some of our major problem weeds are going to be thistle that we already mentioned. Field bindweed can be a real serious problem in the vineyard because it likes to grow up your trellis. I mentioned dogbane, which is another one, poison ivy. You don't want that in your vineyard, right? And it loves the trellis, and it can cause all kinds of problems. So these are just a few. And the point is that when you look at them, they all have somewhat different times of year when they are most susceptible. If you've got a big Canada thistle problem, spraying in April is not going to do you any good. You want to wait until probably for a year like this year, towards the end of June, when those thistle plants are in the bud stage, just before they actually flower, to kind of optimize the translocation of the herbicide down to the root system and kill those roots. If you're looking at field bindweed, the optimum time to get that is when plants are at or past the full bloom stage, which is not going to be until July. And you don't just use Roundup, you use Roundup and you use some 2,4-D as well, okay? Roundup and 2,4-D or Roundup and Banville. Now, I just mentioned two herbicides that are kind of anathema to the vineyard, right? We're really concerned about 2,4-D and dicamba drift. So obviously, you're not going to use those as spot sprays in an existing vineyard. And if you use them in a field that doesn't have a vineyard growing next to them, you still need to be aware of what might be growing next, because you could have a tomato crop or an orchard or something there, which are also sensitive to these herbicides. But the point is that Roundup by itself doesn't kill all weeds equally well. So again, your weed identification is important. Not all weeds are equal. Don't treat them all the same. Now, this is a very complicated table that we're not going to get into today, but I put it up there because, again, it gets at this point that herbicides are like prescription drugs for weeds. And if you don't know what the weed is that you are dealing with, you're not going to be able to choose the right herbicide. Remember, we said that the difference between a successful weed control program and a completely unsuccessful program is knowledge and the application of knowledge. So you need to control your weeds. And it used to be that we would say, well, get yourself a good book on weed identification and learn to identify them at the seedling stage. And in fairness, as much as we talk about that, that's a difficult challenge, and not a lot of people are good at it. I used to be much better at identifying weeds at this seedling stage like this than I am today, because I have other people in the lab that do a lot of that for me, and I just don't get out doing that as much as I used to. Point is that if you're going to be good at it, you got to keep doing it. Maria, is everything coming through okay? You guys are hearing me well?
Yeah, we've had a little bit of lag on your mic, but otherwise I can hear you just fine.
Okay, well, hopefully, like shout it out if I need to slow down or stop or something. So the thing, let's see now, what happened? Yeah, this is the slide I wanted to say. Well, technology is going to allow us to be dumb and still be able to identify weeds, because now there are a number of these plant identifier apps that you can get. I just downloaded this one called Picture This Plant Identifier this afternoon. I haven't tried it yet, but the reviews are really good. And it's got like 147,000 ratings or something, gets a 4.7. So I'm definitely looking forward to trying this. It's got a $30 a year prescription fee. But, if you can go out and take pictures of the weeds in your vineyard in your established vineyard, this is where weed identification also is really important, almost more important than it is at the site preparation stage, is after you've established your vineyard, because you're going to have a kind of a cycle of, there's certain types of weeds that come up in April and May. By the time you get into June, you're dealing with different species of weeds altogether. And as you go through the summer, some of you, if you know your weeds, will know that weeds like madder and prostrate spurge, they're really like July and August weeds. And then you get into September and October, you've got the groundsels and the sorrels, the winter annual weeds that start coming in. So you'll make a lot, and you have to select a herbicide that you can use on all of those. And an app like this, I think, has got a lot of potential to help you do that. So I had mentioned earlier this idea when I said the do's, like I said, use the 0 seed threshold. And you might say, well, come on, like that's crazy. Nobody can do that. And clearly, so the data in this slide are the number of weeds per square yard in 4 different fields, 4 different farms that we had sampled many years ago. And farm B, if you look, they had about 1,300 weeds per square yard. When I say weeds per square yard, what I'm really talking about there is we take soil samples real early in the spring, we go into the greenhouse, and then we germinate out all of the weed seeds that are in that soil. We keep doing that over and over and over again until no more weeds come up. And we count them, we identify them, and we count them all. So we knew in this field, by the time it stopped, more than 1,300 weeds had emerged from this single sample of soil that represented a 1 square yard. And I'm talking about a pint of soil that represented that. So they were not doing it, but then you look over here at Farm D, and they've only got 200 weeds per square yard on their farm. And it turned out that almost all of the weeds that they had consisted of foxtail. Of course, foxtail is super easy to control. And if you have questions about that, we can talk about it later on. But it is, with herbicides, it's like the easiest weed to control. So they have a really easy job, and they've done this by using this 0 weed seed. They see a weed, pull it out. Don't ever let it go to seed. Okay, so what about herbicide resistance? And this is, preparing for the presentation today, I've gone back through our research reports. And of course, we're looking at horseweed here. And in our research reports, which are mostly from plots that we did at the OARDC research station in Worcester, we didn't have any horseweed until about 2010, 2011, 2012, which is about the same time that you started getting it in your vineyard as well. And of course, the reason for that was that it had developed resistance to Roundup in the soybean fields and had gotten out of control there. And then it's got this windborne seed that can blow. In the case of horseweed, it really can blow for miles, spread all over the state, falls into your vineyard, into your neighbor's apple orchard, et cetera, et cetera. I have it coming up in my patio all the time. Never used to have that. So now it's everywhere. And a number of years ago, this is probably about 2013, 2014, we had gone out and we had collected horseweed from a bunch of vineyards and some vegetable farms in different places around the state. The locations are all here in this area. It says, I think over here, axis title. And that's actually, this vertical scale is supposed to represent 0 to 100, that's percent weed control, with the 100 meaning we had killed all of the weeds. Hold on, I got to think about this. I think I'm saying this wrong. That's 0 down here. The bottom axis is rates of Roundup, rates of glyphosate. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 pounds of acid equivalent per acre. The normal use rate is about 2 pounds of acid equivalent per acre. And so I should have looked at this slide a little more closely before I decided to use it today. Give me just a second to interpret it properly. So I'm getting no control. Okay, I'm not, trust me on this one, please. You know, when someone says trust me, you're supposed to watch out, but you guys mostly know who I am and you know where to find me if I mislead you, and you'll come looking for me. So I'm not going to lie to you. But all of these, I think with the exception of this one right here, this blue line, were super resistant, and we had to use like several quarts of Roundup before we got any effect on them at all. Okay, so that's my embarrassment for the day, not to be able to interpret my own slide. This one shows it much better. These are all of those different biotypes that were represented by a colored line in the previous graph. And they have all been sprayed with the 2 quarts, with the, you know, probably the 1 quart per acre rate of Roundup. And this is several days after we had sprayed them. There were some of these varieties were 16 times more resistant. It took 16 times more than that 1 quart per acre rate to give any control of them at all. So they're highly, highly resistant. So your Roundup is no longer working for you. So we've been talking a lot in recent years about the use of Rely as one way to get the horseweed under control. And in this area of the slide here and here, we had a lot of horseweed in our plots back in 2016. And we sprayed Rely 280 at 56 ounces per acre. And so that's what, roughly little less than 2 quarts to the acre. And the horseweed in this case was about 6 inches tall, and we got great, great control. So that's a tool that you have. We've gone in with Rely, and you know, when we've had horseweed that had gotten kind of tall, we had gone in and just kind of quickly mowed the tops off it to get it down below the wire, and then sprayed it with Rely. So that worked well as well. That worked well also. But I do want to caution you to be careful with Rely on your trunks, okay? And even though we tend to think of it as a very safe herbicide, there have been some fruit orchards where there has been damage by spraying the trunk of the trees. So especially anything that's remotely green bark, keep it off of those. And you can see here we had grow tubes on there when we put the applications on. You should be looking at a slide with 4 panels in it now. This happens to be an orchard, but you know, when we're talking about, if we're using a herbicide in an orchard and using the same herbicide in a grape vineyard, the knowledge is transferable from one to the other. So we've got a heavy population of weeds, including horseweed here. But down here, we've got Surfland, Carmex, and Zeus Prime XC plus Chromoxone, all herbicides that you can use in the vineyard, and look at underneath those trees, pretty much completely clean. And this is like 90 days after we spray. That's a pretty hot cocktail of herbicide that's being used there. But the point is that there are residual herbicides that you can use to control it. So some of those here, some of those pre-herbicides that are going to work for you, oops, I want to go back. Some of the pre-herbicides with pre-emergence activity, residual in the soil, that you can use to kill horseweed in your vineyard, or to prevent it, let me put it that way, to prevent horseweed in your vineyard, are in particular Allion, that should be Zeus XC, not Zook XC, so Z, or I'm from Canada, ZEUS XC, and Matrix. Now, there are some sulfonylurea resistant horseweed populations out there. So if you happen to use Matrix, that is a sulfonylurea herbicide, and it doesn't prevent the horseweed from coming up, you probably have a biotype of horseweed that's resistant to sulfonylureas as well as the glyphosate. So, then maybe you want to be thinking about Allion or Zeus. And actually in our greenhouse work, Princep and Carmex has worked okay too, but probably not quite as effective as the first three that are in bold font. So you can use those, horseweed tends to germinate profusely in the fall of the year into October, November, even December some years. And it's going to start to germinate again early in the spring as well, and it actually it's almost like it germinates 12 months of the year now. Its biology has changed somewhat. So if you've got an emerged population, I still think Rely is the most effective herbicide that you can use to tank mix with Allion or with Zeus or with Matrix, or to use it by itself if you just want to burn the horseweed off. But you could also use Gramoxone. Gramoxone, of course, is a herbicide that from a mammalian toxicity point of view has a lot of problems, and you need to be very careful about that. It's a restricted herbicide, but it will kill horseweed. It will only kill horseweed when it's at a very small stage, whereas Rely will kill horseweed at larger stages. And most of you have seen this slide before. It basically just outlines the herbicides that you can use in the planting year. And then the next one outlines herbicides that you can use in subsequent years. So, you've got some that you can't use. For instance, Allion, you can't use it until after the vines have been established for 36 months. So you had to have planted in 2017 to use Allion this year, okay? But Allion is a very powerful herbicide. It's expensive, but you're paying for a high value product. But you gotta have your vines planted for 36 months. Matrix, you can use it the year after you plant. Chateau, you can use it the year after you plant. Zeus XC, yeah, so I list Zeus XC and let me see, Zeus Prime XC. They are years 3, and in the case of Zeus XC, years 4. So 48 months out there, okay? So you have to kind of stage it in. You also have to pay attention to your pre-harvest intervals. The herbicides that are in the green font are the herbicides that also provide control of horseweed, okay? So if you've got a problem with horseweed, and you're using these herbicides, there's 2 reasons that you're still having a problem with horseweed. It would be because you're not including a burn off, okay, on emerged horseweed, or you're just missing the cycle. And the time you really want to be trying to control horseweed would be like really late in the fall or fairly early in the spring. Like, at this stage of the game, you're dealing with horseweed that's probably going to be knee-high or higher. This is not the time to be going after it with with herbicides. This is kind of a rescue operation where you're going to pull it out or mow it off or something, but don't let it go to seed if you can possibly avoid it. I'm not going to really talk a lot about 2,4-D drift or drift watch. Everybody knows about the drift watch site where you go in and register your farm. Got great pictures of what it looks like, but we've all seen these things. What I really want to talk about is, I will say one thing. This is kind of I had this slide originally as a diagnostic symptom slide because you can see like those, I can't hardly tell if that's maple or oak from the picture, but my point was, and in the bottom picture, I think that's probably blue bud, red bud that just finished up blooming. But these are all indicator species for 2,4-D and dicamba. You go outside of the vineyard and you see injury on species other than the grapes, and that helps you kind of figure out where your drift problem may have come from. But the point I wanted to make with this slide today is that you should be trying to look at your risk factors. Who's operating the farms around you? What are they being used for? This is the Slate Run winery outside of Columbus. in this panel. This is just a Google Earth shot from that, but they had some drift coming in back about 2013 or so, and it came from this cornfield over here. But there's kind of like, you can't really see it too well from this slide, but right in this area, there's an old easement through here, and there's an old road here. And you could see that that had served almost like a venturi to kind of suck the drift that was coming out of this field in, that was hitting up against the tree rows and stuff. And, you know, with a venturi, it actually accelerates the flow of air into this, and it was coming right down here and right into his vineyard. So identify your hazards. I want to talk for just a minute about the field deployable detection system. And again, most of you have heard about this in the past. Josh Blakesley and I have given presentations on it. OGIC, as well as the Fruit and Vegetable Checkoff Program, have contributed funding to help support the development of that. The funding was terminated a number of years ago, so we haven't had any money to do additional research on it. But I bring it up today because I've been told that some of you are wondering, well, could I do something like that in my own vineyard? And the answer is yes. I think you most definitely can, for a very low cost. So this is our field test site, and we've got this weird, basically we put these detectors out at different distances away from, I think the next picture actually shows the sprayer going out. So we ran a sprayer with 2,4-D, and all of these white detectors that you see are downwind from that. The first year we did it just like for 100 feet. The next year we did it for 500 or 1,000 feet away from it. And then so these white splotches are just a fabric that is on these are actually like on embroidery rings. You could do it almost any way that you wanted to. And we use kind of like a Kevlar or Teflon type. Teflon's not the word I'm looking for, but kind of like these sort of durable outdoor fabrics that are used for various, like Tyvek, for instance. House wrap would be an example of one. And we had them in these embroidery rings. So I'm only going to tell you how I think I would try to do it. And I think it actually makes sense for you to consider this, because the problem with, if you have a drift event, by the time you realize what's going on, it's often too late to detect residues, and almost always too late to determine when it happened. So these little fabric swatches are really, really good at collecting the herbicide that gets deposited upon them, and kind of giving you a stable matrix to retain that herbicide deposit for later analysis. So what you do is you need some tall tomato stakes, that are at least at the sort of the height of the canopy, and we kind of jury-rigged these so that the fabric swatch was on a bit of an angle towards what we thought would be the prevailing wind. And you put them in your vineyard at different locations. Maybe you want, again, this is a very seat of the pants estimate, but maybe you want a couple per acre or 3 or 4 per acre. And you go out at minimum once every week, and you just take the swatch off, and you label them all individually, put them in a plastic bag, and you store them. Now, I would say store them in the freezer. I was trying to get a hold of Dr. Blakesley to get his opinion on that. I haven't been able to reach him. That would be my default, would be to store them in the freezer. You want to label them, where they came from really carefully, number them consecutively, and then put those numbers on your field map so you know exactly where they came from. And then you just, every week you collect them. And when you get into, we really haven't started active 2,4-D and dicamba spraying yet, because soybeans are just getting planted now, right? We had some burn downs, but this is the real, serious time now through the end of June. So maybe this time of year, maybe from the 20th of May until the end of June, you sample twice a week, and you just keep those swatches. And then the minute that you see herbicide damage in your vineyard, you either have just collected a swatch or you collect the swatches on that day. And that's going to give you this very stable matrix from which you're going to be able to tell if you have a residue. And that's going to help you to pinpoint exactly when that spray drift took place. And that's going to help you determine where it came from, because the applicators around you have to keep records of when they sprayed. Okay, and of course, take pictures using your cell phone of any, what I'll call, if you see someone spraying around you, take a picture of it, spraying their corn and soybeans, because then you got a time-dated picture of that taking place. And I think that's a great place for me to stop. I want to acknowledge, well, we are kind of acknowledging here that OGIC has funded a lot of our research over the years. We greatly appreciate that. And probably a good time just to knock it off and take some questions if there are any.